Hello, welcome to part two of your lecture, Is New Media Really New? Or What is New Media? As I said in the first section, this is the second strand of our module, Analysing Media, Film and Music, and the focus on this strand is digital. This is the first week where we take a media focus, and then we'll have a film and a music digital sessions as well. If you haven't listened to the podcast, which was part one, please do that now and then come back to this afterwards. You'll notice that you're watching this as a YouTube video embedded into Talus, which is a kind of form of digital video, right? And I want you to think as you're watching this and experiencing this part of the lecture, how that is different or similar to watching video or analog television. VHS and Betamax were early forms of home entertainment before we all had Netflix. And television used to not be digital. If you're at home with people who are of older generations, ask them this week about their experiences of watching television when we had far less channels available. Okay, so let's move on to this part of the lecture. We're going to focus now on Lev Manovich. He's a kind of really key and important theorist in kind of computational studies or digital media studies. And he's also quite a controversial figure. A lot of people find some of his work quite scientific, quite cold, not really embedded in culture, and also kind of perhaps techno-determinist, so thinking too much of the digital or too much into the digital. So we'll also talk about criticisms of his work. But let's start with Lev Manovich's own criticisms of what other people talk about when they talk about new media. So these are what he calls misconceptions and simplified assertions about new media. So the idea that analog media is always continuous and digital media is discrete. Anyone from my generation who remembers putting a pencil into cassette tape when it's got stuck will remember how each kind of crank moves a discrete movement. Cinema is tiny little cells, each frame on a long piece of celluloid. It's only when it's kind of cranked through and interacts with the light at a particular distance that we see images which appear to be continuous. Now, digital media is discrete, but we experience it in quite continuous ways. You might think about listening to music. You don't get the sense of this kind of ones and zeros, these tiny bytes that are being broadcast at you. It's a file and you hear the melody of the music. Another critique he had was the idea that new media is multimedia and analog media is not. And again, he used cinema as this example, and obviously cinema has image and sound, to be really simple with it. All digital media share the same code. This idea that everything that's digital is just code, and that's it. And he's arguing, of course code is at the base of digital, but that seems to be simplifying it somewhat. That our experience with a VR headset is different from using WhatsApp, which is different from you watching this on YouTube, on a computer if you are, or on a mobile phone or a tablet. And to simply call all of those kind of the same thing as the digital and as code doesn't really get into the nitty-gritty of the kind of media landscape we have today. He also has a problem with the idea that people think about analog data being sequential and new media allowing random access. Anyone that's been into a paper-based archive will know they can be often quite chaotic spaces where the archivist and even sometimes yourself will be wandering around trying to find bits of paper. And that digitalization inevitably involves loss of information. This is a debate. So on one hand, people talk about the digital kind of having this ephemerality and things being able to be kind of eternally stored in the digital, which is just highly problematic. It's really, really expensive to store any kind of data in the digital. And if a platform like Flickr, which stores photographs, suddenly stopped running, as Parler was taken off by Amazon earlier this year, you would just lose all of your information that you thought was stored there. A loss is important. We lose pixels, we lose quality when we compress and put something on YouTube. But also there's this debate between, does a digital create longevity or does a digital threaten everything with loss? And then finally, the idea that digital media can be copied endlessly without degradation. I talked there about the idea of kind of compressing files for Facebook or YouTube. Sorry, there was one more. The idea that new media is interactive and old media is fixed. There's a massive problem with this word interactivity. everything's always been interactive, right? Conversation is interactive. The telegram was interactive. The telephone. Listening to music in your house and dancing to it is a form of interactivity. So this idea that just because we can press buttons and touch the screen in ways that we wouldn't have done at the cinema doesn't mean that that old media wasn't interactive in other ways. Okay, we're going to move into some of the details of Manovich's argument now. And I want you to think critically about the 5 things that he uses to define new media. And think about these 2 questions. You might want to pause, write these down, take a picture of the screen. The first question is, can you see any problems about the principles he defines? Can you think of any pre-digital examples in which the principle, each one of them as you come along them, exists? So have a think about that as we talk about each one. Does it ring any alarm bells in your mind about your own experiences with digital media? You know, this doesn't hold up, this doesn't seem true. And can you think of other kind of non-digital, pre-digital forms of media where you could also see this principle? So what we're doing here is testing Manovich's proposition or his thesis, his argument. So this is Manovich's kind of big theory of the principles of new media here. The first is numerical representation. New media objects can be described formally, as in by that he means mathematically. New media objects are subject to algorithmic manipulation. They're programmable. And here's an example that when you create a game, or an interactive space, you would create hyperlinks between things, and you can keep changing that as well. But fundamentally, it's all in the computer. It's ones and zeros. And the code is a kind of logical language that you're behind the scenes, it's code, and you've just added in file types and etc. to have a visual appearance to the human users. But at its base, it is really code and logic. Principle 2 then is modularity. New media objects are composed of samples of discrete objects, pixels in images, or bytes, 1001100. Could be any bunch of zeros and ones. There's a fractional structure of new media, and that the smallest elements can be combined to make bigger ones, and so on, but each of those maintain their singularity. And the example is here with this YouTube video. The PowerPoint that I'm presenting is in this video, but the video hasn't taken the PowerPoint away. It's still on my computer somewhere as the PowerPoint. So here's an example. This might get trippy. You've got a picture there of this picture and this slide on the slide in a PowerPoint. And the picture and the slide exist as separate things, but I can keep copying and pasting them into that slide, but the single things themselves still exist. So there's multiple versions of the slide there inside of itself. And so you have the many, modular, lots of different things put together. The third thing then is automation. So that numerical code and modular structure of new media allows for automation, for computers to do things automatically without our human involvement. Computers are therefore capable of both low and high level of automation that requires little to no human interaction at the extreme end. A really low level of automation is word templates. I want to create a calendar there, I can see an example of, or I think a CV. I just click on that template and Word's done the hard layout work for me. Really low level automation. High level automation, the Turing test. Can the person work out who is the computer or the human by the way that their responsiveness is reacting to the impetus discussions? And then really high level of automation is in surgery, where they use AI to do surgery now sometimes. So that's really robotics at that far end. So variability then is Manovich's fourth point. And here he argues that new media objects are not fixed. They exist in infinite forms. Rather than simply being reproducible like photographs from a master, they are mutable and fluid forms with poetic language. Hypermediacy and interactivity are examples of variability. Hypermediacy refers to being very aware of the interface. Interactivity means your kind of ability to do things with it. And he recognises a distinct cultural shift from Fordism, the industrial age, to product on demand just in time in the post-industrial age. If you think about how games are released, the cyberpunk game just a few months ago had to be withdrawn because it was so buggy. But often games are released with several bugs in them as beta versions, and the fans really want to get involved. And things are fixed from this kind of mass player feedback. Here's an example from early 2020, back in the pre-pandemic days. A Tom Hanks meme was completely changed by everyone that used it. Look at me, I'm the meme of the decade now. Didn't quite work out, I think, given that lots of major political and pandemic-related events happened there. But this was early on in the year. And it just shows you how one meme that circulated can be manipulated by each person that uses it. And the image itself is no longer just anchored in the meaning of the image, as we might think about in very basic textual analysis, but it is given lots of different kinds of meaning for the anchorage added to it with the text. And the meme itself is the kind of powerful bit of this. It's just this image of Tom Hanks pulling a funny expression, circulating in different ways around the internet and being used in different ways. And the last thing that Lev Manovich talks about is transcoding. And this is a translation of the cultural into the computational and vice versa. So computer files speak to other computer files in dimensions which belong to their own, what he calls cosmogony, it's difficult to say, rather than to human nature. So they're not interested in file content, but file size, type, compression type paths and formats. New media exist on two levels, on the cultural level and the computational level. We think about the fact that the human and the computational is coming together here, and it's that translation between the two that Lev Manovich thinks is very distinct for digital media, that we are never simply just speaking on cultural, that the cultural has to be translated into the computation, and the computation gets translated back into cultural. And it's really important to think about it at the beginning of the production process. Algorithms are not neutral and objective. They are written by human beings. And the kind of output that then comes from that code when it goes back into cultural is already embedded in particular kind of cultural norms established by those programmers. So I'll bring you back to those questions that I said at the beginning of this section. I suggest you pause the video and rethink about these questions and make some notes that you can take into your seminar. Can you see any problems about the principles he defines? Can you think of any pre-digital examples in which the principles exist? Okay, we're now going to focus in the last bit of this part of the lecture, part 2, on some criticisms of Lev Manovich's approach. So coming back to this idea, what do we mean by new media? For him, he's talking about what he calls computational media. There's something changes when the kind of computational sciences, Babbage's machine, and the photographic, the inscription media come together in a kind of symbiosis, and we have this computational media, which for Manovich and many others is this kind of radical new form of media where everything is kind of together in the same machine. Alex R. Galloway wrote his article 10 years after the language of new media, unsurprisingly 10 years after Manovich released his book. And here's a quote from him in 2011. Manovich was writing in 2001. Galloway says, to put Manovich in context, the first phase of web culture, one must admit, carried a revolutionary impulse. Call it the Saint Just to today's imperial era. Manovich's book is a product of that first phase. Walls were coming down, hierarchies were crumbling, the old brick and mortar society was giving way to a new digital universe. On the one hand, new virulent ways of looking at the world were forming with unprecedented ferocity, sometimes conveniently labelled the California ideology, coalescing around the neoliberal impulse to open source everything. Information wants to be free, desire wants to be free, capital wants to be free, and the promise to liberate mankind in ways only dreamed of by our forebears in the social movements of the 1960s. What's changed since 2001? And then also 2011. Now we are another 10 years, so we're now 20 years after Manovich was writing this year. So you might want to think about it. I mean, here there's all this kind of Manovich is writing in this era when Silicon Valley is kind of just emerging as this kind of libertarian, utopian way we're going to save the world. And now we're very much looking, it was a much, in the public discourse is a much darker idea of what happened with Silicon Valley. Are we at the end of the story? There's some great documentaries on Netflix at the moment about the power of Facebook and other corporations that you might want to have a look at. There's the book Surveillance Capitalism, which is big and hefty, but worth checking out as well. And Christian Fox's work, which is in the reading list for this module around social media, an introduction to social media. The Capitol riots at the beginning of this year are worth thinking about in terms of the effect that social media platforms had on that event. And then also the response by Twitter and Facebook and other organizations like Amazon afterwards in trying to control who can speak where. Are we in a different era of new media or digital media or Web 2.0 now? So Manovich was writing in what we would have called Web 1.0. This is before social media was a thing. So let's look at how Galloway critiques Manovich, and he isn't particularly favourable of Manovich's work. So he says Manovich favours the newness of new media as their ability to be software applications, perhaps less in terms of the cultural. And there's some other technical definitions of new media that you might want to look at. So people like Kittler and Chun looked at hardware rather than software. Lovnik and Benkler that new social interactions media do not facilitate. That was their focus, the kind of social aspect of new media. Does it do something new socially and culturally? Terranova and Thacker looked at the idea of networks of information. Castells does as well, the idea of the network and connectability, connectivism, collective intelligence, all of these ways that we're somehow thinking together and working together and being together is far more important than the actual software or the computational stuff behind it. And then Galloway says Manovich's myth of interactivity is misguided. And he also thinks that Manovich overplays the cinema. And in doing so, he kind of suggests that the cinema can do all the things that computational media can do, and therefore kind of counters his own argument. So it's worth thinking about that. Does that matter? Is Manovich still right that these things are inherent to the digital, even if it doesn't make them new? And another point you might want to think about is, is Manovich too narrow in focusing on only aesthetic and formal elements of new media? I'll go back to the things I brought up in the podcast, the idea of the user, power, contact, money, and business. And here's some suggestions of ways you might think about the question, to what extent is new media new, which is one of the essay questions on offer for this module. So what happens if we turn instead to the role of the user or audience and think about, okay, so with a podcast or YouTube, how are they different to pre-digital forms in terms of how you interacted with them? The political economy of the industries. So, the Hollywood film industry had the big five who dominated and controlled it through monopolies and later oligopolies, which is when many organizations have all the control. Is that the same now? Just because the product might look different, is the actual powers of the industry any different? You might think about Steam or Twitch and the power of kind of independence to rise up, or esports celebrities or influencer. Has that changed the power dynamic in any way? And questions then related to globalization, finance, power, and agency, going back to some of the theory from the globalization section of this module. The role of the technologies and their use in relation to democracy in the public sphere, really important at the moment with all of these discussions that have been happening post the Capitol riots. Other ways then of framing a response to the question, is new media really new? Is Manovich too focused on the computational specificity? And could these offer other ways of doing that? You might want to think about these in your seminar. Maybe pause the video here for a moment and try and think about some of the examples that were included in this week. So podcast versus pre-digital or non-digital auditory media, this YouTube video embedded in Tallis and how that might be different or similar to other audiovisual forms of media that aren't digital, and go through each of these kind of points here and think about some of your own arguments that you could take into the seminar. So one of the kind of questions often raised is, is Manovich, like McLuhan and others, too much of a technological determinist, too focused on the computational, the technological when he's analysing new media? So another quote from Galloway. He says, the grand argument given in Manovich is really one about media in general. So not new media specifically. That is that to mediate is really to reframe, that mediation in general is just repetition in particular. And thus that the new media are really all the artifacts and traces of the past coming to appear in an ever-expanding present. And that's quite a media archaeological perspective on the argument. And it's also a theory that's reiterated in Gruson and Bolton's famous book Remediation, in which they argue new remediates older media forms for a dual logic of immediacy, the illusionary sense that things are right before us, and hyperimmediacy, the expectation of an interface. So there you might think of YouTube, where the immediacy is that you can see the liveness of the person on the video, like you do on TV, live TV, someone's here, like me, going hello. But also the hypermediacy, that there's an interface that you can add comments, you can see the next up, you can see the web browser, you might see any other things and pop-ups on your own computer that you've asked to kind of come up as overlays. So there's still that trace of old media there. It's still a video. YouTube refers to kind of the television of you. Tube, being kind of a slang term for the television or the box. So the kind of big question to think about with this lecture is the defining factor of new media actually the fact that they or it is not new at all? You're now going to leave this video and take part in the third part of this lecture. And the third part is the Galloway reading. But you don't need to reread it. Obviously, if you haven't read it, dive in, go for it. But I want you to skim read it and think about how reading it as a digital file is different from how your experience might be of reading an actual book. If you have the Kindle app on your phone, you might want to try this with a free Kindle book or one that you already have as well, instead of the Galloway article, and think about how is it different reading a Kindle book to reading a book that you can actually open and touch with your hands. So a good exercise to do is part 3 of the lecture, completely independent, completely up to you whether you want to use the Galloway example yourself and just think about what it's like to read online and to read by touching something, or go for your own examples with a Kindle book and a book of your own choice. And I will see some of you in the seminar, and Adria will see the rest of you. Goodbye.